The room smelled faintly of tatami and old wood, the kind of scent that lingers in traditional inns nestled in the quieter folds of Japan's countryside. James sat cross-legged on the thin futon, its uneven stuffing pressed into his legs as he stared out through the sliding shoji doors. Beyond them, Mount Fuji loomed under the early afternoon sky, its snow-dusted peak catching the light like a silent ancient god. He had hoped it wouldn't look this perfect. A soft wind rustled the leaves outside, and somewhere in the distance, a crow called, sharp, lonely. James exhaled slowly, rubbing his face with both hands. The room was small, cheap, and barely insulated, but it was quiet, and for now that was enough. On the floor beside him lay a crumpled tourist map, half covered with the gear he had laid out for tomorrow. A lightweight tent, his sleeping bag, a burner stove, and a weather-beaten rucksack. He had meant to bring newer kit, gear he and Lucy had planned to use on their first real hike together. This hike, in fact. Fuji had been her idea. A romantic challenge, she called it. Eyes shining, oblivious to how quickly those same eyes would come to look elsewhere. James clenched his jaw and shook the thought off like a cold wind. He picked up the map and traced the contour lines with his finger, trying to re-anchor himself in something solid. The Aokigahara forest pressed against the northwest slope of the mountain, a dark, dense sprawl that intrigued him more than it frightened him. Not that he planned to camp there. Probably. But he wanted something wild. Something that would bite back. He glanced at his watch. Still enough daylight to walk into town, grab supplies, maybe a bento box or two, and some whiskey if he could find it. He would set off early tomorrow, just after sunrise. A solo camp in the shadow of Fuji. Freezing, lonely, and unplanned. Not exactly how he'd imagined it when booking the flights, but then again, neither was her voicemail. He stood, stretching his limbs, and slid open the paper doors. Cool air spilled into the room. Fuji stood unmoving in the distance, inscrutable, silent, as if watching him. "Right," James muttered, mostly to himself. "Let's see if this place can help me forget." He didn't know it yet, but the mountain had its own plans. The next morning, James stepped out onto the frost-kissed earth just as the first light of dawn spilled over the horizon, casting Mount Fuji in soft hues of lilac and rose. The peak still held a faint mist around its shoulders, as if reluctant to let go of the night. He paused, letting the chill bite at his cheeks, and breathed in deeply. The air was clean in a way that felt almost unnatural, thin, dry, and edged with the sharp scent of pine sap and cold stone. Somewhere beneath that, there was the faintest trace of smoke. Someone in the town below must have lit a wood stove, the comforting smell drifting up through the trees like a memory from another life. His boots crunched gently over the brittle leaves and frost, the sound loud in the stillness. Above, a few ravens called out across the treetops, their harsh voices ricocheting off the branches. In the distance, the slow, rhythmic clatter of a train echoed through the valley, winding its way towards the place he didn't care to name. Closer by, a breeze moved through the forest canopy in hushed sighs, carrying with it the earthy scent of damp undergrowth and old bark. There was a sweetness to it, subtle but real, like wild mushrooms and moss warmed by yesterday's sun. James crouched near a slope, the weight of his pack resting awkwardly against his shoulder, and watched the sunlight crawl down Fuji's face. The snow at the summit shimmered gold now, dazzling and cold and impossibly far away. He had expected some kind of awe, maybe even a jolt of healing clarity. Instead, he just felt tired. Still, there was a kind of peace in the simplicity of it. No words, no texts, no forced reassurances from friends who didn't know what to say. Just the mountain, the woods, and the sound of his own breathing. He took another breath, slower this time, tasting the morning fully. It was not the kind of moment he had pictured when he dreamed of coming here with her, but it was real. He let out a shaky laugh, more breath than voice. "You missed out, Luce," he murmured. "This could have been ours." But she was a continent away now, and the silence had no answer. Shouldering his pack, James turned towards the trail, the sunlight beginning to dapple the forest floor in pale gold. The pain hadn't left him, not by a long stretch, but out here it didn't feel quite so loud. The trail had grown steeper, winding up through switchbacks littered with snow-crusted roots and stones slick with morning frost. James leaned into the incline, his breath coming in steady clouds, his thighs beginning to burn with effort. The rhythm of it, step, crunch, exhale, was comforting in its simplicity, a kind of quiet drumbeat to march his thoughts out of the cavern they always seemed to return to. Around him the forest was waking, pines creaking faintly in the wind, shedding tiny needles that tumbled into slow spirals through shafts of light. Sunbeams filtered through the bare-limbed maples and cedars, casting a golden sheen on the snow-covered undergrowth. Even in winter's grip, the land seemed to breathe, slow, patient, ancient. James paused at a bend in the trail, shifting the weight of his pack once more. He looked out over the mountainside, where a thick fog curled low over the valley like steam rising from a tea bowl. The beauty of it all struck him suddenly, not in a wave, but a quiet pulse, like a heartbeat he'd forgotten was still his. And then he saw movement. He froze instinctively, holding his breath. About 20 meters ahead, just off the path, the snow stirred. From behind a curtain of tall bamboo grass emerged a family of wild boar. 4 of them, snuffling and rootling through the crusted snow. Their bristled coats were dusted in frost, and their breath came in visible puffs as they pushed their flat snouts into the earth, grunting softly. One of the younger individuals slipped on the ice and tumbled into its sibling. They squealed in protest, then carried on as if nothing had happened. James felt a smile creep across his face. Genuine, unforced, the first in what felt like weeks. For a long moment he simply watched. He felt no urge to take out his phone, no impulse to move closer. Just this, the cold air, the wild stillness, the quiet miracle of life surviving winter. It reminded him that the world was going on with or without him, and maybe, just maybe, he could do the same. The smaller boar continued their foraging, oblivious or indifferent to James's presence. He stood completely still, barely daring to shift his weight. A twig snapped somewhere behind the cluster of bamboo, and the younger one stiffened for a moment, ears twitching. Then, with a suddenness that tightened his chest, a massive shape emerged from the undergrowth. The boar was huge, easily the size of a large dog, its thick dark hide mottled with coarse hair bristling along its ridge like a drawn line of iron wire. Tusks curved from its snout, yellowed and chipped, and its small eyes locked onto James with a depth of attention that sent a jolt through his spine. For a heartbeat, they simply stared at each other. James didn't move. He could hear his pulse thudding in his ears now, a deep, drumming echo in the hollow of his chest. His mouth was dry. Every part of his body seemed to tense and wake up at once, the kind of primal alertness no modern life could train you to. He imagined Lucy laughing nervously, clutching his arm if she were here. Except she wasn't. And never would be again. The Great Boar gave a short snort, steaming breath curling from its nostrils like smoke from a forge. Then, to James's astonishment and quiet relief, it simply turned, trotted past the younger ones, and disappeared into the forest without a second glance. The snow muffled its retreat until even the crunch was gone. James let out a shaky exhale, half laugh, half sigh. He pressed a hand into his chest. His heart was still hammering like a drum roll. "Well," he muttered under his breath, the ghost of a grin tugging at the corners of his mouth. "At least I know it still works." The silence that followed felt different, less empty. He stood there a moment longer, then adjusted his pack once more and continued up the trail. The trail itself leveled out slightly, granting James a reprieve from the punishing incline. He found a smooth rock beside a gnarled cedar and let his pack slide off with a grateful sigh. The air up here was thinner but sharp with purity, tinged with pine, melting snow, and the faint mineral scent of mountain stone. He filled his lungs with it, letting it flush out the lingering ghosts that clung to the corners of his thoughts. He sipped from his water bottle, eyes drifting across the landscape. Twisted roots veined the snow like ancient scars, and through a break in the trees he caught a glimpse of the valley far below, hazy and golden in the early light. It felt far from everything, and that at least was a kind of relief. The crunch of boots on snow pulled him from his thoughts. He turned to see an elderly couple slowly making their way up the path. A man with a knotted walking stick and a woman with a bright red fleece, both wearing wide-brimmed sun hats and gaiters dusted with frost. They looked surprised when they spotted him. The woman raised her hand in greeting.
"Oh, konnichiwa,"
she called, eyes widening. Her voice was light and friendly, but her tone had the unmistakable air of polite astonishment. James stood and smiled. "Konnichiwa," he said with a slight bow, instinctive and a little stiff. The old man chuckled, and the woman looked him up and down with a curious warmth.
Hakujin desu ne?"
she said, something about him being a foreigner. She seemed more amused than wary, like she'd stumbled upon a deer who had politely asked for directions. James nodded sheepishly. "Yes, British." He tapped his chest and shrugged, smiling. "Just hiking." The woman made a surprised sound and said something rapid in Japanese to her husband, who responded with a quiet laugh. She turned back to James and mimed walking with exaggerated fatigue, fanning her face and pointing to the mountain, clearly asking if he was going all the way. "Not Fuji today," he replied with a half chuckle. "Just camping. Somewhere up here." He gestured vaguely into the trees. They nodded, though it was clear most of his words were missed. Still, the warmth didn't fade. The woman's expression grew slightly more serious, and she said something about kuma, tapping her hands together and growling softly. James caught the word. Bear. "Ah, yeah," he said. "I've heard." She opened a small pouch on her belt and pulled out a tiny silver bell, delicate and worn, strung on a thin leather loop. She held it out to him with both hands, her expression earnest. James hesitated, genuinely touched. "For me?" He accepted the bell with a grateful bow. "Thank you. Arigatou gozaimasu." They both laughed at his pronunciation, kind but amused. Then, in unison, they returned his bow, slightly deeper, their eyes smiling. James' hand went instinctively to his pocket. He wanted to offer something back, not just out of politeness, but because the gesture had struck something in him, He rummaged through his small pouch and found it. The lucky rabbit's foot keychain. Soft, grey, once a gift from Lucy, half meant as a joke, half as some charm to protect him on solo hikes. It had always felt strange in his pocket, like a relic from someone else's story. He held it out to the woman. "Here, for you," he said, gently pressing it into her hand. "Lucky charm, to return her luck." She examined it curiously, then with delight. The man raised his eyebrows and let out a low, impressed whistle. The woman bowed again, deeply, cradling the strange Western talisman like a treasure. James smiled, and this time it felt easier, lighter. The couple waved, then continued up the trail, slowly vanishing between the trees, their quiet voices floating behind them like birdsong. James watched them go, the bell in his hand gently chiming as he clipped it to his backpack. It sang softly as he started walking again, its delicate voice cutting through the silence, warding off whatever might lurk unseen, and maybe, just maybe, helping ward off a few things inside him too. The trail narrowed as James took the left fork, waving once more at the couple as they disappeared up the other route. His legs were tiring, but his spirits felt lighter, like someone had lifted a layer of weight off of his chest without him noticing. The soft chime of the bear bell swung gently from his pack, a faint, cheerful sound that seemed to harmonize with the wind threading through the trees. He hiked for another hour, maybe more. He didn't check his watch. The forest had changed subtly. The trees grew denser, older, their trunks coated in moss the color of jade. Sunlight filtered through the canopy in golden ribbons, catching in the fine mist that lingered above the snow. The trail bent and wound like a lazy stream, hugging ridge lines and ducking through clusters of bamboo. A stream gurgled nearby, its waters crystal clear, bubbling over black volcanic stones. James slowed his pace, letting the landscape pull him in. He ran a hand along barkless trees, its surface smooth and cold like old bone. The birds were out now, tiny flashes of movement darting between branches, their song delicate and strange. Somewhere ahead, a woodpecker knocked out a rhythmic beat that echoed softly through the trees like nature's Morse code. He took off his backpack beside a low rise and wandered a few paces off the trail. From here he could see Fuji again, towering in the near distance like a guardian spirit watching over the land. Clouds moved slowly across its slopes, casting long shadows like brushstrokes on white canvas. For the first time in weeks, James let himself stop thinking. He just was. The wind brushed through his hair. He closed his eyes. The sun, the scent of pine, the distant chatter of birds, the warmth slowly returning to his fingers, all of it washed over him in waves. The ache in his chest, the thoughts of Lucy, the bitterness and the confusion, they were still there, somewhere beneath it all, but they were quiet, dwarfed by the mountain, by the moment. He smiled to himself. No one to see, no one to impress, and took a deep breath that seemed to fill his whole being. Maybe, he thought, not everything needed to be healed at once. Maybe it was enough for now to just be lost in a beautiful place, and know the world was still capable of this kind of quiet wonder. The mountain trail gradually leveled beneath James's boots as he pressed on, the punishing incline giving way to wide, quiet stretches of forest that felt less traveled. The path itself thinned to little more than a suggestion, just a scattering of flattened snow and the occasional stone markers mossed over with age. He paused, adjusted the straps on his pack, and looked to his left, where the forest thickened, deeper and darker between tall stands of cedar and ancient bamboo. There was a silence here that felt different. Not absent, but present, as if something was watching. Not threatening, just aware. James hesitated for a moment, scanning the tree line. Then he stepped off the path. Immediately the air seemed to change, cooler, stiller. The snow underfoot was untouched, and the trees grew closer together, their trunks twisted and gnarled with time. He moved carefully, methodically, taking a knife from his belt and nicking the occasional tree with a small, clean slash, a breadcrumb trail carved in bark. Other times he had tied a length of biodegradable ribbon, bright orange against the dark green, around low-hanging branches. "Not getting lost today," he muttered, more to fill the air than anything else. Still, as he pushed deeper into the trees, a strange tension settled into his shoulders. Not fear exactly, but the kind of alertness that ancient instincts woke up for. It reminded him of stories he'd read late at night whilst researching Japan. The old myths, strange creatures of forest and fog, yokai, spirits of mischief, vengeance, and sorrow. He thought of the kitsune, fox spirits with shifting shapes and unknowable motives. Some were protectors, others tricksters. Then the kappa came to mind, those odd turtle-like creatures said to lurk in streams, offering riddles and pulling people under if disrespected. There were others too, one-eyed monks, women who appeared from the mist, asking impossible questions, things that left footprints in fresh snow but no body to cast them. James chuckled to himself, half nervous, half amused. "Great," he muttered, "just what I need. Getting lost and toyed with by forest spirits." A sudden breeze rustled through the canopy above, setting the trees to creak and the bamboo to rattle. The sound was oddly melodic, like wind chimes whispering secrets. He stopped walking for a moment, turning slowly in a circle. The forest was still, but that kind of stillness that feels staged, like a pause between lines in an unseen play. James shook his head, smirking at himself. "Too many late nights in YouTube," he said aloud, trying to keep the humor in his voice. Still, he kept one hand near the bell hanging from his pack. It jingled faintly as he moved forward again, a small, steady sound that seemed to push back the silence, step by step. By 11 a.m., James was starting to feel the weight of the morning in his legs and lower back. The climb, the cold, and the constant alertness of being alone in unfamiliar wilderness had worn him down, and his stomach had begun to grumble with growing insistence. He figured it was time for a lunch break, somewhere quiet and somewhere flat, somewhere not uphill. As if summoned by his need, a low fog began curling through the trees up ahead. It wasn't ominous, more like a soft veil settling over the forest, golden at the edges where the sunlight caught it. Through the shifting mist, he spotted an opening, where the trees thinned into what looked like a shallow basin in the terrain. Curious, he veered toward it, stepping over roots and under low-hanging branches. After about 10 minutes of weaving through undergrowth and brush, he stopped, eyes widening in disbelief. A hot spring. Tucked in a natural hollow, ringed with smooth, volcanic rock and surrounded by moss-covered boulders, the water steamed gently into the crisp air. The surface shimmered with the heat, a glassy mirror disturbed only by the slow swirl of rising warmth. Pale reeds bent lazily at the edges, and a small rivulet trickled in from a higher source, keeping the spring gently replenished. James approached cautiously, crouching and dipping a finger into the water. Warm. Not scalding, just warm enough to chase the cold from his bones. A grin spread across his face. "Oh, you absolute beauty," he said aloud, glancing around to make sure this wasn't some dream conjured by dehydration or a kitsune playing tricks on him. But no illusions fell away. Just steam, trees, and birdsong. He hesitated only a moment longer, then shrugged off his pack and began peeling off layers. The cold bit at his skin as he stripped down, but he didn't care. He placed his lunch, a wrapped rice ball, some smoked fish, a boiled egg, and a flask of tea on a dry rock at the edge, arranging it within arm's reach. Then, carefully, he stepped inside. The heat enveloped him instantly, a whole-body sigh erupting from his chest as he sank into his shoulders. Every muscle in his back seemed to unravel at once. The aches dulled, the cold retreated, and the forest sounds faded to a kind of distant lull. "Bloody hell," he murmured, tipping his head back and closing his eyes. "This is actual heaven." The mist swirled lazily around him. The bell from his pack now resting quietly beside his clothes. Every so often a bird chirped or a tree creaked, but nothing intruded on the moment. He reached for his lunch, taking a bite of the onigiri, and letting the comforting salt and vinegar of the pickled plum inside hit his tongue. Warm water, warm food, solitude that didn't feel lonely. For the first time in what felt like forever, his mind wasn't dragging Lucy into the picture. He wasn't replaying the betrayal or the months leading up to it. He was just here. He opened his eyes. A monkey was sitting just across from him on the bank. "Bloody hell," James muttered, half choking on the egg white. The creature didn't move. It just sat there. Smallish, shaggy, its reddish face stark against the pale winter fur. A Japanese macaque, he realized. The kind you sometimes see in those photos lounging in hot springs, like the little forest emperors. Except this one wasn't in the water. It sat flat on the rock at the edge, feet tucked under its body, gazing at him with a solemn stillness that felt more human than animal. James blinked, wiping some moisture from his brow. The monkey's eyes flicked, not towards him, but toward the food. It didn't inch closer, didn't make a sound, just watched. Polite, patient, almost like it knew the unspoken rules of sharing space. James shifted in the water, slow and deliberate, sliding closer to the rock where his lunch lay. The monkey didn't flinch. It simply tilted its head, as if to say, "Go on then. I'm not here to mug you." He sighed and picked up a piece of smoked fish. It wasn't much, but it could feel the creature's interest sharpen just slightly, the way its eyes followed the food from hand to hand. James looked at it for a long moment. "Well," he said, lifting the fish. "Seems rude not to offer, doesn't it?" He gently extended the fish towards the monkey, holding it over the rock. The macaque blinked once, then padded forward slightly and took it from his hand, not snatching but receiving, as if accepting a gift. It stepped back again, fish held delicately in its fingers, then sat and began to eat with neat little motions, occasionally glancing at James between bites. "No offense," James said, mouth curling into a faint grin, "but you're better company than most people I know lately." The monkey looked at him, fish half eaten, and blinked slowly. James leaned back into the water, watching the mist drift between them. The two creatures alone in the woods, sharing warmth, sharing silence, sharing lunch. At first it was just a look. The monkey had paused mid-bite, the half-eaten fish held gently in its small, weathered hand. Its eyes met James again, round, dark, and impossibly deep. There was no mischief there, no base instinct. Just stillness, a kind of presence, something watching, knowing. For a second, James forgot he was looking at an animal. And then, uninvited, a memory surfaced. Lucy laughing in that absurd way she did whenever a documentary showed monkeys grooming each other. She used to nudge him and whisper, "See, that's real love. You clean their bugs and everything." She loved them, had always wanted to see them in the wild. A trip to Japan had been her dream. James' chest tightened. He saw her again. Not her laughter this time, not her smile. The image had changed. It was her face, flushed and guilty. The tremble in her voice when she admitted it. The way she had said the other man's name like she was still unsure of how much she should confess. The betrayal lit a slow, sour fire in his belly all over again. His expression darkened. His jaw tensed. He scowled without meaning to. And the monkey didn't flee, didn't flinch. It looked at him again, not with fear from his movement, not even curiosity. Something softer. Something that stopped just shy of human but hovered there, weighty and ancient. It looked full of knowing, of recognition. It tilted its head, as if reading him, as if sifting through all the broken things inside him that he thought he'd buried under smiles and solitude. James felt a laugh build in his throat. Not a happy one. Thin, uncertain. Good, he thought. What the hell's wrong with me? Projecting grief onto a bloody monkey like I'm in a Studio Ghibli film.
Pain fades in time.
Clear, calm, feminine. It wasn't in his head, not a whisper from his memory. It came from outside him. James froze. The sound drifted like the steam around him, gentle, low and steady, like wind through pine needles. He stared. The monkey hadn't moved, but it was still watching him, holding his gaze with unwavering softness. His breath caught in his throat. The forest went quiet, utterly still. Even the wind paused. "What?" he said out loud, voice barely above a whisper. The monkey blinked slowly, and James suddenly felt very small. The monkey's eyes never wavered from James. Then, in that same calm, clear female voice, it spoke again. "Your pain, it will go." James's heart hammered in his chest, his mind racing to make sense of what he had just heard. He blinked, pinching himself lightly, convinced it was some trick of exhaustion or cold, but the voice came again, steady, gentle, and real. Before panic could take hold, before he could question his own sanity or scream at the empty forest, the creature, this monkey, continued, voice patient and kind.
"I am not merely a monkey. I am a Satori."
James swallowed hard. The word rolled in his mouth like a foreign stone. He'd read that word somewhere before. Yes, that's it, the Satori. Mysterious yokai said to read the minds of travelers, spirits both feared and revered in the mountains around Fuji. Known to appear as monkeys, they could peer into your heart and soul. His rational mind screamed to run, to dismiss this as hallucination. But the warmth of the water, the earnest calm in the creature's eyes, and the unexpected kindness in that voice rooted him in place. The Satori's gaze softened further, as if offering a quiet promise.
"Your sorrow is heavy, but it will not define you. Pain fades. Trust in time."
James closed his eyes, a slow breath escaping him, caught somewhere between disbelief and a fragile hope. The serene calm in the monkey's eyes shifted. Its voice, still unmistakable, grew firmer, edged with a quiet gravity that settled over James like a sudden winter chill.
"But you must not hide from what lies beneath,"
the Satori said, tone steady yet unyielding. Suddenly an image blazed through James's mind, sharp and unforgiving. The moment he discovered Lucy's betrayal, the shock that shattered him, the primal fury that consumed every part of him. How in that blind rage he had taken her life. The violent, irreversible act he buried deep inside himself, locked away beneath layers of denial and shame. The creature's gaze pierced deeper.
"You cannot run from the weight of what you have done."
It was neither condemnation nor pity, just an unflinching truth.
"Not to judge you, but to remind you. Healing begins only when you face the darkness within. You must come to terms with the choice you made in fury."
James's breath caught, his chest tightening painfully. He wanted to shut it all down, push the memory away once more, but the Satori's eyes held him fast, refusing to let him turn away. The Satori's gaze remained steady, but James's mind spiraled uncontrollably. Fragments of a memory flashed through his thoughts, unbidden and harsh. The long drive to his father's farm on the outskirts of town, the bitter silence filling the car, the cold, clinical task of cutting Lucy's body into pieces, the dull weight of the knife in his hands, the sharp, excited squeals of the pigs as he threw the chunks over the fence, their hungry cries slicing through the quiet farm air. A cold sweat broke over him. He wanted to look away, to shut the images down, but the Satori held his eyes, unwavering and patient.
"You cannot hide from what you have done,"
it repeated softly. James's breath hitched, voice barely audible.
How do we live with that?"
The Satori's voice was calm, almost gentle.
"By facing it, not running. By accepting your darkness, you may begin to find light."
For a long, heavy moment, the silence stretched. The only sound was the gentle ripple of the hot spring and the distant whisper of the wind through the trees. The forest felt colder now, clearer, less forgiving but brutally honest. James closed his eyes and whispered, voice breaking.
"I don't know if I can live with it."
The Satori's expression softened, voice lowering to a gentle murmur.
"No one is ready at first. But to carry such a burden alone is to be trapped by it. The path forward is yours to walk, step by step, in time."
James exhaled slowly, letting the weight of those words settle deep inside. Somewhere beneath guilt and despair, beyond darkness and regret, a faint, fragile ember of hope still flickered, waiting. The Satori simply nodded. No more words, no parting wisdom. Just that single, solemn gesture before turning away and walking silently into the mist, vanishing between the trees as if it had never been there at all. James sat for a moment longer in the hot spring, steam curling around his body like the last trace of something sacred, something ancient. For the first time in months, perhaps years, he felt a strange, quiet stirring inside him. Not peace, not forgiveness, but possibility. A thread of hope. He stood slowly, muscles aching from the soak and the sudden cold that kissed his wet skin. He began to dry off, humming softly to himself as he pulled on his clothes with a newfound care, a touch more purpose in each motion.
"I can never bring her back,"
he murmured, voice low and hoarse.
But maybe I can put more good into this world and make up for it or something.
He glanced over to the place the Satori had disappeared into, a strange kind of reverence in his eyes.
Maybe I could start a monkey sanctuary,
he said with the ghost of a smile.
Yeah, a place in the hills. Real quiet, peaceful. Monkeys everywhere, maybe.
A deep, guttural laugh. He froze. It came from behind him. The air changed. He felt it before he heard the second sound. He turned barely a fraction of an inch, too slow. A blur of black fur and raw muscle crashed into him, knocking the breath from his lungs. Claws, curved like sickles, raked down his sides. The bear, a massive Asiatic black bear, the crescent moon of its chest barely visible in the gloom, rose onto its hind legs with a roar and came down onto him with a primal, terrifying force. There was no time for fear, no time for prayer. Only pain, sharp, hot, and immediate, flooding his body as it was thrown to the forest floor like a rag. The woods echoed with a final, ragged scream. And then, only silence. Only the wind in the trees. And somewhere off in the distance sat a thinking mind, unjudging, watching, remembering, being.